Okay, we are now ready to finish up or optimize the scene that has the flowers in it. And there's just a few modifications that should be made before we use the object within the scene. I did make a few modifications and added a few things. Kind of added some areas of pollen in the center, and also set up a Hypernova object for the petal that can be turned on and off. So for a close-up, we'd be able to turn on the Hypernovas. If not, for the rest of the scene, we wouldn't want to have all that extra geometry. The new objects I added are going to add a lot of polygons to the scene, so probably end up turning them off for far away. If I really wanted to get close up to these objects and render that out, then I can turn on those little pollen areas that I added. Go ahead and take a look at a render. And you can see all that extra detail. There's a couple of things. If we go into the material, the pollen object, if we go to illumination, if you want to reduce some of the calculation time, you could turn off the generate GI if you're going to be rendering with global illumination. Just kind of going through and kind of deciding which objects should really be part of the global illumination. For the most part, you'd want it to receive the GI, but that's really going to depend on the scene. I also want to note the Hypernova object. Take a look. I just have it set to 1 for the render and the editor, because it doesn't need to be any higher than that. It's set to Catmull-Clark mode, and subdivide the UVs based on the edge. Between the edge and boundary mode, there wasn't really much of a difference. The standard, however, did have a weird bit of stretching, which might end up fitting the texture a little better depending on what you're working with. So it really depends on the object. So what we need to do is set up some display tags and also modify the materials. So if we go to the material, we want to select, we could even do this by selecting multiple materials. So whichever ones have a texture on them, I'm going to go ahead and select the flower petal, the stem, and the stem leaves. And I may need to have the material editor open in order to get the ability to modify all of them at the same time. And I'm going to change the texture preview size down to 64. So it's really going to reduce preview quality, because we don't want to have way too many textures showing up. It's just going to slow down the scene. I'm going to turn off the petal NURBS for now. And we can set up display tags per section. So if you just want certain textures to show and not others, or different levels of detail, you can set that up. One thing I'd want to do for the pollen, if I decided to keep it in the scene, either way, I'm going to set up a display tag for it that is going to be set to the level of detail, which is going to reduce the amount of clones. We'll go ahead and set that down to a point where we can still see them, but not many of them. So I can set the level of detail to 10, and then turn off the textures for the object. We can also set up, if you wanted to just have a skeleton, we can then reduce and just turn off that detail adjustment altogether. And it looks like maybe that's not going to be the best display, because it is going to go from the bottom up. You could set up a box mode for that. That's pretty low detail. But we'll just use the wireframe, turn off that option, use the level of detail, making sure the textures is ready to be turned on and off. And then the flower itself, we could set up, so basically just for the petals, and then the stem would be something separate. And whenever you assign the display tag and use the level of detail on the cloner object itself, it will reduce the amount of clones being seen. So I've also turned down the clone amount for how many we have. If I was to have a close-up, then I would want to increase to maybe this higher level. But we're mainly going to be using this on a tree, so we don't want to have too many. So I'm going to set up a display tag on the main object, which I have in a null. Just the level of detail, the texture option, whether or not we want to see those. And then level of detail in this case is really going to modify all the clones and show us the petals. So we can see only a partial amount of petals showing, which in this case kind of creates a pretty neat looking flower. So if we reduced the amount of clones we had, we'd be able to create kind of another type of flower out of that. It's really more about just getting it set up for the transfer. And now we have, I've gone ahead and renamed and made sure that everything, all of our deformers and effectors are renamed to match this object. There's going to be no conflict. And then that's all in one main group. Also important to check and make sure that on the bottom, where all of the stems are meeting, that we have the object axis set to that point where we can intersect it with a branch, and it won't be going through or hovering above any of the branches. You can choose whether or not to delete. I had a kind of atmosphere in here just to render this out ahead of time to take a look at it while I was making it. But you can delete that from the scene now if it's no longer needed. But what we're going to be doing is using the XREF object within the other scene. So we can just choose not to use the atmosphere or the floor object. To avoid setup time, it's usually a good idea just to remove that stuff from the scene if it's no longer needed. It also free up some of the memory, so it's a good idea to kind of remove all that. I'm going to keep it just so that when I get into the XREF object, you'll be able to see more options and how you can turn things on and off. So I'm going to go ahead and save the scene, and then I can switch over to the leaf generator tree, which is just that tree working on before with just the leaves set up. And what I want to do is go over to Object, Scene, and select XREF. Go to the attributes. We can choose the file name. And then it's going to load the entire scene into our current scene. So as we can see, the scaling, there's a huge difference. We also have the ground plane loaded and all those other objects. So if we go to the Object tab, which is set to include, what we can do is choose which objects are going to be part of the scene. So I'm going to take the atmosphere and just X out all of them. The floor, we can X all those out. And that's what I meant by saving setup time, because if you have an object you created that you want to be able to use for this, that's a good idea just to not have those other objects in there so that you don't have to go through and turn them all off. But you do have the ability to do that. So we're going to go through and just turn off everything except our flower group. And then if we want, we can go through and let's say we don't want to have some of those other objects in there. We can turn them on or off. So for now, I'm going to go to the flower center, which is making those little pollen objects, and I'm going to remove those from this scene at the moment. Okay, so now we have just that object, just the flowers. Now, but we don't have direct access to display tags this way. So if I needed to show the texture, I would need to go back to the scene and make modifications to the tag that way. Save out the scene. And then when we switch back over, it's going to need to refresh, show the textures, and kind of build the preview. So whether or not you want to end up using them at all, decide whether or not you really want to use the XREF. But it is a much simpler way of setting things up. So now we can go into the attributes once again for the XREF, and under the Object tab, we do have a pivot matrix, which allows us to adjust the three primary vectors, so the position, scale, and the rotation. And what we can do is reduce our size, the X, Y, and Z, for this flower object, because we don't want it as large as it currently is. And I'm getting a little bit of lag on the refresh. Go ahead and turn off the textures. But we'll see how this loads in first, and then I'll see if I need to do that. What I want to set up too, which I already kind of have added, is the display tag for the leaves. We can use the visibility or the level of detail to really tone this down while we're modifying it, so that if we make changes, it's really not going to press the system for resources in order to update the OpenGL. So now what we can do is take this XREF object and drag it into our generator. So right now we just have a cluster of leaves, and now we can add in this new object. And it's going to operate in just the way that it will with the cluster to generate the instances. And depending on the mode that is set, we'll have to take a look. Right now I have the clone set to sort, which means we need an effector to control that sort. So right now the flowers aren't showing, just the first object in the list. I'm going to go ahead and change the mode just so we can see some of the clone showing. And depending on the level of detail, I may have to make some changes in order to be able to see the objects, because at the moment it's not showing any. Okay, so I've just updated the level of detail, and now it is showing some of those flowers. So we can see just a few of them, just enough to get a sense of scale and overall position, keeping in mind that we are only showing a very small percentage of what's actually going to be in the scene. I'm also going to go ahead and just turn on the count to 5,000 for now. So something a little bit lower, and that way we can just make the adjustments without huge impact to load times. So I'm going to go ahead and we just take a look at a render, how this currently is turning out. So because we have so many individual flowers compared to how many leaves there are, there looks like the tree is kind of overloaded with flowers compared to the amount of leaves. So as we increase the amount of duplicates and the amount of clones we have, we're going to end up with a lot more flowers than leaves at this point, because we don't have anything to control which objects are showing where or how many of each. But overall, it looks like a pretty good start to begin with, and renders very quickly, which is nice. This rendered out in 15 seconds, and the size is of the frame, I believe, is 720 HD. We'll have to double check. just to make sure. Yeah, 1280 by 720. So that's not bad for the overall render time. Anti-aliasing is only at 1 by 1 by 2 by 2, and that would need to be 2 by 2 by 4 by 4 or so for animation. So that will take a little bit longer to render, but overall seems to be performing pretty well. Just making sure, also always make sure and check that render instances is turned on also for the flower object. It's not going to make too much difference because the clones of the flower object are going to be instances. Just to double check and make sure, always a good idea to go through your clones because otherwise you're going to, at this point, really overload everything. Not a great idea. So we can modify the scale of all of the objects by modifying the transform, which I currently have the size set to 0.12, and that's going to modify everything, so all the different clones. A nice advantage of using the XREF is the ability to modify the size of the object independently without having to set up any additional null objects that you would modify the size of or anything like that. It also helps preserve some of the different texture settings. So now what we want to do is modify the object and reduce the amount of clones we're seeing of specific clones. There's a couple of different ways we can do this. One very quick solution is to just kind of double, in this case we want more leaves and less flowers. So what I can even do is use the MoGraph instance object. So select the leaf cluster, add an instance object, and add that to the list. What that does is basically doubles the amount of that object that we have. So we should see more leaves showing up. And like I said, that's just a really quick way to reduce the amount. And that way we're not creating any additional geometry. We're just creating an instance of what we already have in the scene. So even if I go ahead and render this now, we'll take a look and we should see a nice difference. So switching back and forth, we can see a very large amount of flowers reduced. So like I said, that's just a really quick way to do it. Another thing we can do, let's say you want to create some areas that are just not so densely packed, but you don't want to modify the clone amount or anything like that. You just kind of want to maybe create some patches or holes. What you can do is add a null object and add that into the generator. So now it's much more thinned out. The null object is a great solution for the more finite types of clones. Really meaning, I'll go ahead and take a look in the attributes. When you're using a different type of mode, so right now we're on a volume mode, which means we can set the count. But if we're on sort of a fixed mode, which would be vertex, edge, polygon, center, then every single point or every single edge, every polygon center is going to have an object. And instead of having to go through and create all of these different selection tags, and you still want to have an overall coverage, you can add in these null objects to kind of create some different patches in different areas where there won't be any clones at all. So that's just kind of a neat thing you can do. That's basically the fast solution. There is a much more controlled solution, which is also pretty quick. It's just you do have to add another object to the scene. So it's really not something that's going to be intensive. But I did want to show that there are a lot of different ways to modify the clones. I'm going to go ahead over to the other scene and modify that display tag to turn off the textures, just to improve performance a little bit. And we're going to add in an effector for the generator object. and we're going to use the step effector. Now, before this is going to work the way we need it to, we need to go into the generator, so the cloner object. We need to change the clone type to sort. So right now what's going to happen is whatever's on the top of the list is going to show throughout the entire object, and that's all that's being cloned, because we don't have anything to control it. Under the Transform tab, I'm going to go ahead and increase the weight of the clones. Now, every cloner object in MoGraph has its own independent weight and UV system. So that has nothing to do with textures. Whenever you go to the effectors and see U transform, V transform, and the weight transformation, that has nothing to do with textures or maps or anything. That's specifically just for MoGraph and the instances. It's an entirely separate system. So the option we have in the step effector is the modify clone. What modify clone will do is modify that sort setting. So we're going to set it to 100% for the modify clone. At the moment, there's really nothing happening, even with the visibility. So what we need to do is make a few changes. We can also use this to scale or modify the object. So I'm going to choose to make a little bit of a scale change. Let's do 0.5. Let's make the transformation space the effector. Uniform scale should be good. Go ahead and open up the minimum maximum values. Set the minimum to -100 to start with, and make sure the maximum's at 100. And we also want to make sure that this effector is part of the effector list, which is why before it wasn't showing anything. So let's go back to the step effector. If I turn off modify clone, we're not going to see any changes to the clones. And if I go ahead, increase that value, we'll start to see them switch out over into the flowers. So we can adjust how many clones are being changed over to the flower with either this modify clone amount, depending on if we basically only want to change the scale of the clones. Visibility is only going to show the clones being modified. Visibility is available in pretty much every single effector. So if we turn on visibility, we're only going to see, in this case, the modified clones. So that's a way to basically remove everything and just show the flowers. I'm going to turn that off. That's a really good solution for different animated effects, and we'll see those probably a little bit later. We can set up a bit of rotation if we want, which is going to modify anything that is still available. And if we go over to the Effector tab, we can make a couple of changes. We can increase the step gap, but we do need to modify the spline first for that to work. So by modifying the spline, we can also affect where the clones are showing, how they're being affected, and which ones are going to show up. The step gap doesn't look like it's having too much of an impact on this current setup. And that's probably just because of the way I have the settings. I'm going to go ahead and reset the spline for the moment and just set the step gap to 0. Sometimes it can be really dependent on the minimum maximum value. So one thing we can do to affect how many clones, besides just using the modify clone, is to reduce the maximum value, which is going to start on one end. Now once we hit about 50%, pretty much all of those clones are gone. Now the other end of basically the sort of internal noise that's working to control this, we can start to come up on the other end and pull in the clone changes. So this way everything would become a flower if the minimum is set to 100. So what you can do is just reduce the maximum value to about 70, and then we're going to see a pretty good distribution between flowers and leaves. I'm going to go ahead and select the generator or the cloner object, increase the count to 10,000. You can take a look at a frame. So the distribution isn't bad at all at the moment, and we can adjust those sliders, the maximum, or using the modify clone value in order to really control exactly which objects are showing where. And the more we have in the list, the more we'll be able to affect at the same time, and we'll also probably see a better impact of the step value. Now, the biggest limitation, and kind of going back to the XREF object, if we wanted to animate the flower motion, we can modify the clones, but the individual flowers themselves would need to be, if we wanted to have maybe petals fluttering, things like that, that needs to be created, the effectors for that need to be created within the other scene. There are options to set the scene time so that you can have everything match up, and if you set yourself up a loop with cached objects, it can become a little easier to set something like that up. So for the mix between the two scenes. Also, if you set up your wind in a different scene, and you went to scale the objects down and copy and paste that object into another scene, the wind doesn't match up because you've reduced the scale of the objects. Having the XREF makes it a little bit easier.